Well, Premier, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure it is to be here again in Hobart. As Neil has just said, I'm no stranger to the state. I get the chance to come down and visit my in-laws from time to time. Now, they often have some interesting things to say about the southern part of the state, as you can imagine, but I'm not going to go there this morning, given that I'm here. I might say something when I get further north later today. Ladies and gentlemen, my task this morning is to give you the backdrop for the address that you'll receive in 20 minutes or so from your Premier and Treasurer about the state budget. And the backdrop I want to give you this morning focuses in succession on the global economy briefly, and then on the Australian circumstances and in relation to the global economic circumstances, and then finally I'll say a little bit about your own state from our perspective. So I'm not going to analyse the budget. I'll leave the Premier to address to you, her citizens, how the government, your government, is positioning this state in relation to the circumstances that I describe. Let's make a start. We hear a lot, folks, about the two-speed economy here in Australia. I want to point out to you, if you weren't aware of it, that the two-speed economy we experience in Australia is just a reflection of what's happening elsewhere in the world. The chart that you can see up there behind me is a chart produced by the International Monetary Fund. It represents forecasts by the IMF. Notice a couple of things there. Firstly, notice the much faster rates of economic growth, and that's what these bars represent. The much faster rates of economic growth, obviously, in the emerging and developing economies. If you look carefully, you can see those bars there in grey. You might also see that over the last year or two, they've been slowing a little bit, it's true. Primarily the Chinese economy is slowing down deliberately in order to avoid an outbreak of inflation and wage growth in China. It's very important for the Chinese government to ensure that inflation doesn't derail the Chinese experience. It's not just China, there's very strong growth in the other developing economies like Brazil as well. Then if you look at the dark bars, the dark blue bars, there you see the advanced economies growing much more slowly than the developing economies and the emerging economies. Excuse me. And that two-speed is reflecting itself very much in what's happening here in our own country. There you can see Australia marked out in the green, and you see that the IMF is forecasting for Australia growth above 3%, on average 3.5%, precisely the forecasts that our own Federal Treasurer released the other day. The other thing I would draw your attention to in looking at this chart, ladies and gentlemen, is that while the global economy, which is marked there in blue, that's simply the average, has been slowing over the last couple of years as an echo of the global financial crisis, there is no sign of global recession here. What's happening in Europe notwithstanding. The European economies are in recession, and that recession could in fact get deeper. A word more about that in a moment. But there's sufficient growth, certainly in China and Greater Asia and in the other developing economies, and even in the United States, which is staging a very slow, but I think well-founded recovery. The United States is still the world's largest economy, and that, together with the growth in China and elsewhere in Asia, is pulling the global economy along. But there's no sign of recession, and I think that's reflected in our own economy as well. There's a lot of nervousness about what's happening in Australia, but can I assure you that at the global level, the aggregate level, there is no sign of recession. Let's talk briefly about the Eurozone, which is in recession. It's very hard to see how the Euro problems might resolve themselves. At base, there's a problem there that we recognise as Australians. Ladies and gentlemen, every successful federation in the world, and that includes ourselves, the United States, Canada, Germany. Every successful federation of states is a stool that stands on three legs. Economic union, that is to say, free trade amongst the member states. Currency union, a single currency. And obviously, political union. At the time of the federation of the former Australian colonies, prior to the actual act of federation, the individual states, colonies as they then were, often raised economic obstacles against one another. The Victorians were famous for raising tariffs against the New South Welshmen. Each of the state banks, as they then were, was on the cusp of issuing its own currency. and of course the colonial governments had not federated. Fortunately, the fathers of federation, and they were, ladies, fathers of the federation at that time, had the good sense to build into our constitution those three things. Section 96, no restraints on interstate trade. The currency and banking power transferred to the Commonwealth government, and obviously political federation. If you have those three things, then your federation is stable. The problem with the Eurozone, ladies and gentlemen, is that it is a stool that sits on two legs only: economic union and currency union. The hope is that those two would provide political union, but there is no history to demonstrate that that will occur automatically. It is just as likely that the union flies apart as it is that it grows a third leg of political union. This is not news to our European friends. It's an experiment, and one that many people would wish would succeed. But we need to recognise, as I say, that it has inbuilt structural instability. We also understand how different parts of federations can grow at different rates, and you understand that very well here in Tasmania. If I can pursue this analogy just for one moment more, can I point out that the Australian dollar is overvalued for the Tasmanian economy, while at the same time it is undervalued for the West Australian economy. What that means, of course, is that economic conditions here are tough. In that sense, and please hear me clearly, in that sense only, is Tasmania a little bit like Greece within the Eurozone. You're suffering from the fact that you have a currency, you are part of a union for which your currency is overvalued, and that makes economic life very difficult for you here in the state. Our West Australian friends may well resent the fact that they have to contribute to the union at this particular juncture, but what's clear, or ought to be clear, is if, and I don't suggest that this is likely for a second, but if the West Australians decided that they would secede, then the Western Australian currency would immediately appreciate, and the West Australian economy would probably go into recession. That's what would happen to the Germans if the Germans were to allow the Greeks and the other southern European states to abandon the Union. You see, the euro is overvalued for the Greeks and the Spanish and the Italians and the Irish. It's undervalued for the Germans. So while unemployment is 25% in Spain, it is 3% in Germany. While the Spanish and the Italians and Greeks are struggling with massive current account deficits, Germany has become a current account surplus country. Ladies and gentlemen, the Germans can't afford to allow the southern European states to abandon the Union. They will make side payments in precisely the same way that our federation arranges for side payments. The difficulty for them is that it's not done within a political context, but they will need to do it for their own good, let alone for the future of the euro. So in the bottom part of my slide, you can see my own forecast there for what will happen. Regrettably, this process will result in long recessions, and there'll be great difficulty in resolving what's happening in Europe. There will be some mixture of debt default, possibly even inflation. But I'm not calling a breakup of the EU. I think that's the least likely outcome, because the Germans, as I say, in many respects have more to lose than the Greeks. But we could see quite substantial political instability in Europe before this is over. This chart represents a correlation of political instability. You can see it there across the bottom of the chart if you can read it. Chaos, demonstrations, riots, assassinations, and general strikes. The leftmost bar on this chart, the clear one, shows you the background level of this sort of activity, and you notice, of course, that Europe is an unhappy place at the best of times. These charts all rise up to the right here, as you see towards that black bar, with successive degrees of fiscal austerity, and these data are drawn from the 20th century experience. Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, the data would suggest that long before we've seen an end to this, there will be substantial civil strife in Europe, and nobody welcomes that, but history is against it. What about us here in Australia? The main route via which what is happening in Europe would affect Australia is through the financial markets, and we can see that playing out as we speak. Once again, we'll see interest rates rise. Once again, we will see stock markets unstable, and there may well be some sacrifice of credit availability here. But the good news for us is that our banking system is very sound, and our government at the federal level has plenty of scope to ease monetary policy and, if necessary, ease fiscal policy in order to manage our circumstances. In any case, our economy is far more closely allied to what's happening in China than in Europe, and China's growth has only just begun. And in any case, and this is the big story for us, we have a substantial pipeline of investment, particularly in the mining industry. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we need to be clear exactly how large this mining boom is. Tasmania, as you know, has a long and proud history in the mining industry. You know about the mining industry. It started very early in this state. Here's a chart which shows you mining investment in our country as a proportion of nominal GDP going back to the gold rushes of the 1850s and 1860s. And what you see from this chart is that even before you go to the forecasts, which are up here on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see that mining investment is already twice as large as it has ever been in our settled history. And it's set to go even higher. This week's Economist magazine predicts that the boom in mining investment in our country will top 9% of GDP. What this is doing is driving the Australian economy in aggregate in a way which we've never seen before. Here's a set of numbers. I know you can't read them from the back, and I don't intend to go through them one by one. This table is taken from the budget papers that the Federal Treasurer produced last week. And there we've got the top-line forecasts together with some forecasts produced by Deloitte Access Economics, and broadly speaking, they're on the same plane. Folks, what this table tells you is this, that the Australian economy in aggregate is in rude health. Rude health. Growth is at trend, 3 to 3.25%, possibly even 3.5%. Unemployment is at the natural rate. The numbers, in fact, were lower in forecast, in actual results the other day, 4.9%, than forecast by the Treasury. Inflation is at the middle of the Reserve Bank's range, wages growth is contained, and the current account deficit is doing what you would expect when we reflect the amount of foreign investment that's taking place in this country. At an aggregate level, these are beautiful numbers. As Treasurer Wayne Swan points out all the time, whenever he goes overseas, people mob him. People would love to have these numbers, and it's true. But for us, beneath that set of beautiful aggregate numbers is this chart, which is also taken from the federal budget papers. And here is the story. Folks, the Australian economy is divided into two parts: the resources-related part of the economy and the non-resources-related part of the economy. The resources-related part of the economy is growing faster than the Chinese economy. Last year, as you can see in this chart, and these are Treasury numbers, it grew in excess of 10%. In forecast, according to the Treasury, it will grow at 9%. 20% of the economy is growing faster than China. 80% of the economy is effectively in growth recession. Last year it grew at under 2%. The Treasury will say it will grow at 2% in forecast. The mining boom, fueled by Chinese growth, is pulling the Australian economy along with such force that it bends us out of shape. The aggregate numbers are wonderful, so why all the long faces? Because 80% of all workers are in the 80% of the economy that's growing slowly. Roughly, if you draw a line from Brisbane across to Adelaide, which my colleague Chris Richardson refers to cheekily as the Brisbane line, all very well for him. He grew up in Sydney, south of the Brisbane line. I grew up in Brisbane, north of the Brisbane line. So my grandparents told me very different stories about what General MacArthur did to what Chris's parents told him. And I imagine much the same applies to you safely down here in Tasmania. They didn't even send submarines into the Derwent. Well, this is the modern Brisbane line. Here you can see 80% of everybody working down here in the slow part of the economy, and 20% of people working up here in the economy that's growing faster than China. Why the long faces? Because most Australians get up each morning and they hear the stories of businesses closing, of their friends threatened with losing work or actually losing work. They see all the retail sales falling. They see the sales in the shops at levels they've never experienced, and they think this economy is going to hell in a handcart. And you can't blame them, because that's what they see. Folks, it's like the five blind Indians trying to describe an elephant. An elephant is like a tree. An elephant is like a hose. An elephant is like a rope. If you look at the elephant, you see that the aggregate economy is in rude health. But most people are concerned about the economy because of what they see. And this produces the result that we see here. People put their hands straight back in their pockets and they don't spend. When they don't spend, they don't pay GST. When they don't pay GST, they cause problems for revenue for all of the states. In a moment, you will hear your Premier and Treasurer explain to you how your government is trying to manage the difficulties that have arisen for you on the revenue front. It's a very difficult task. I don't need to tell the Premier that. It's shared by all of the states, including, amazingly enough, Western Australia. Because at the same time that this is happening, people are spending more on health and education, both of which happen to be GST-free. We face the need to rejig the state's finances in order to make expenditure match income. And that's not an easy task. Some final words now about the Tasmanian economy. Thinking about the two-speed economy, I don't need to tell you that Tassie's in the slow lane. But I want you to understand that you're in the slow lane in many respects, not because of anything you did. Those parts of the Australian economy that are in the slow lane are those that have trade-exposed industries that are outside the mining sector. And of course, here in Tassie, a much larger share of your gross state product arises from trade-exposed sectors like tourism and agriculture. These are the industries that are being asked to release resources for the mining boom, a mining boom which is of unprecedented size. They're being asked to release resources so that this whole thing doesn't end up in a burst of wage inflation and we all flame out. You are doing your bit, but it's hard. And therefore, of course, as the Premier pointed out the other day, you deserve your compensation through the income transfer mechanisms. That's what they're there for. And I think she was quite right to rebuke the Premier of Western Australia in pointing out how these mechanisms work and how you make your contribution. Population growth is the lowest that it's been here for a decade and ageing faster than the mainland. You know that. That is at least related to the circumstances because young people leave. They are being drawn away by the two-speed economy, and you have to manage your economy in the meantime. Unemployment is rising, workforce participation is falling, construction is weak, retail spending is still at levels below 2009. You know that. My message to you is that what you're living with is the impact of what's happening in China for the aggregate economy. The aggregate economy is doing fine. You have to manage what's happening in this state. And this is the issue that your government deals with. In the meantime, of course, what this produces is a falling share of the national economy for you. And you may well ask, where are all the jobs? Well, you can see from this chart, they're not going to be in manufacturing. This darker of the lighter blue lines here, that's your manufacturing industry. It will continue to shed jobs like manufacturing around the country. Not going to fall off a cliff, but it will continue to shed jobs. The lighter blue line is accommodation, food and restaurant services, which you might hope would grow, but they're trade exposed, they're tourism related. So you've got flat outlook for that sector. The dark blue line, agriculture, forestry and fishing, that's also trade exposed. Mining, a little bit of mining creeping up in Tassie once again, isn't that good news? And here wholesale and retail trade effectively flat. Oh dear. But there is good news on the jobs front in the areas that you might expect. Healthcare and social assistance, that's the green line at the top. That is the silver lining, pardon the pun, for the ageing of the population. It's okay, they're good jobs, they need to be done, and they bring revenue to the state. Public administration is this green line, the light blue one is education and training. This will be an area in which people spend more money, and Tassie has a very good education system. And professional, scientific and technical services also to grow. There's every scope for Tassie to be a smart state, like the other non-mining states, just north of here. You can do that, and the news is good. But the challenge that you face is substantial, ladies and gentlemen. And what I want to do is finish with this slide that just quickly summarises some data that I've taken from your budget papers, which the Treasurer and Premier will speak about in a moment. It affirms more or less what I'd said, and these are the government's numbers, again matched up with our numbers there underneath. Your state will grow more slowly than the rest of the economy. You will have a higher unemployment rate than the rest of the economy. Your government is not hiding that from you. The explanation for that has nothing to do, in essence, with the government's policy here. It has to do with the circumstances we find ourselves in. At one level, it's terrific. The country is doing extremely well and will continue to do so for the next generation at least. In the meantime, though, it's very, very patchy. And managing that patchiness in different parts of the economy is an enormous challenge, one which I'm sure your Premier and Treasurer is up to as she brings you the budget right now. Thank you very much.